turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to this week's Naked Scientists. This is the programme where we bring you the latest breakthroughs and talk to the biggest movers and shakers from the world of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith. Coming up, how the UK looks set to take the world's toughest line on smoking. Also, the new study showing that last year's Canadian wildfires pumped out more CO2 into the atmosphere than almost every other country worldwide. And why are those astronauts still stranded on the International Space Station?
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
The UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that his government is looking at tougher rules on outdoor smoking to reduce the number of preventable diseases that are linked to tobacco use. To find out more, we put in a call to Linda Bald, who's a Professor of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh.
The government has a piece of legislation called the Tobacco and Vapes Bill. We were hoping it would come to the next stage of Parliament in the summer, but it looks like it'll be into September. In the meantime, there's been this period of potential strengthening of the legislation. So some of the big ticket items that we know about, raising the age of sale, the smoke-free generation, addressing vaping, are still in there, but they seem to have added extra things. And one of them is to put more restrictions on smoking in partially enclosed or outdoor areas.
What's the significance of this?
I think the significance is we still have about 1 in 8 people in the UK who smoke. It's still the leading preventable cause of death. And banning it in outdoor areas actually isn't directly about the health harms, because obviously mainstream smoke and side stream smoke quickly dissipate in the open air, but it's more about the continued denormalization of smoking. So some of the areas that are being discussed, I understand, are things like children's play parks, beaches, university campuses, potentially the whole area around hospitals, town centres. So it's really about taking smoking out of normal life and extending those smoke-free laws.
Is there an evidence base to support these sorts of measures, arguing that they actually work? Because, for instance, I work in a hospital and it, for about the last decade, has been a smoke-free site. And as I walk into work, I see various members of staff lurking, having a crafty fag behind the hedgerows.
So there's a difference between evidence from studies and implementation evidence. So if we deal with the first one, there are some studies, I'm just recalling one from New Zealand, for example, and that looked at pub balconies and outdoor areas next to pubs. They put air quality sensors inside and outside, and they found that actually the smoke, when doors were left open in maybe better weather than we have in the UK, drifted inside. And so people inside were still exposed to smoke when there was an outdoor seating area. And that might have health risks. So there's some evidence to support that. There's also studies that have looked at areas like children's play parks, where it's absolutely the case that if children see lots of adults smoking, it normalizes the act of smoking to a greater degree. There's also an environmental argument where cigarette butts and the filters on cigarettes are a major cause of plastic pollution on beaches. On the implementation side, you're absolutely right. Implementing smoking bans in outdoor areas around hospital buildings, mental health facilities are a particular issue. And on the grounds of hospitals, when you don't have staff to enforce it, many hospitals have extensive grounds, or some do anyway, is actually really, really tough. So there is evidence behind this, but the implementation of it can be tricky.
Would this then add up, if you put all of the legislation or all of the things we're doing here, would this make the UK one of the toughest places to be a smoker? In other words, is the deterrent here one of the strongest globally?
We'd be amongst the strongest countries if they introduced all the things that are in the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, including, they'd be discussing other things like licensing cigarette shops as one of the newer measures.
Linda Bald from the University of Edinburgh. And the announcement from the government follows a call earlier in the week from the British Medical Association for legislation to stop what it's calling a growing epidemic of vape use in the UK by tightening regulations on e-cigarette products and also restricting access to them, and hitting particularly those that are designed to seduce and addict young people. David Strain is the science chair at the British Medical Association board.
We are asking the government to include a ban on all the flavours of vapes that are so attractive. We're asking them to limit the advertising, limiting the bright, shiny packaging and even the naming, the blueberry fizz, gummy bear, candy floss flavours. We want these vapes to be put behind the counter, next to the cigarettes, so they are offered for smokers, but they're not offered and freely available in the same way a bar of chocolate or a bag of crisps is. And finally, we're asking for a ban on the single-use vapes, these ones that you use once, then throw away, which is contributing about 10 tons of lithium waste to landfill every year. That's about the same amount that goes into making 5,000 electric cars, just ends up in a landfill.
Have we got evidence that these seductively coloured and flavoured products are luring in kids and exclusively for those reasons? Or are we at risk of upsetting entrenched smokers who are trying to give up, who actually quite like those flavours, and they may actually be deterred and encouraged to smoke more?
There's two separate questions there. The first is, do we have evidence that these fruit flavours are attracting people? And actually, the evidence for that is very simple. We have seen that with the expansion of fruit flavours, with the more and greater availability of them, we've seen a six-fold increased risk of the number of young people who are being attracted to this as a brand new habit. So these aren't smoking quitters, these are people who've been attracted to it. We're also seeing more than half of 11 to 17-year-olds who use vapes are doing so on a regular basis. And that's just about exclusively the fruit-flavored market. So that's the closest to evidence that that is the reason that these are going for them. The second piece of evidence is the advertising. Advertising works. That's the reason that so many millions are pumped into the advertising campaigns. And when we moved cigarettes from being broadly advertised to behind the counter with plain packaging, we saw a reduction in the number of new smokers as a result of it. The second question is a lot more tricky, whether banning fruit flavours will prevent people from quitting smoking. And this is something that is very difficult to know for certain. We know that about half of all adult vapers are ex-smokers. Now, many of those have gone for straight tobacco or plain vapes. Some of them do go for fruit flavors, and lots of stock services do offer the fruit flavors, but they offer them because they're there. What we don't know for certain is what would the impact of not offering fruit flavors to potential quitters. Now, the majority of people, if they are offered, will take fruit flavoring. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't rather be on a tobacco flavored or a plain vape rather than being on a cigarette. Remembering that cigarettes themselves are harmful, they're associated with cancer, and they're a lot more expensive than a vape. So when we offer every single smoker a tobacco or a plain flavored vape on the day that they buy their cigarettes, then potentially we are offering them a life-saving and cheaper option going forward.
Are you not incredulous, though, David, that we've ended up in this position at all? It did not take Einstein, let alone a public health specialist and the medical profession, to spot that if you have an unregulated industry and it's linked to an addictive substance and you can sex it up, make it look nice and smell nice, that it's going to seduce young people and it's going to hook a whole legion of new smokers.
That's easy to see with hindsight. It's very easy to see that nicotine-containing products very, very highly addictive. And once you're on them, it's very difficult to stop them. What we're at now is a turning point. If we don't stop this now, we're going to see an entire generation that will no longer be able to smoke due to their tobacco and vaping bill, but instead will be hooked on a different drug. And don't get me wrong, vaping is another drug, albeit a legal drug, but it is a drug. What we need to do is now, before we have millions of people addicted to this, put the bans in place to make sure that we don't face another public health crisis in about 15 to 20 years when we suddenly realize the adverse effect that all of these are having on the development of the brain, on the whole body as we go through the change.
David Strain, A new study has found that the carbon emissions from the Canadian wildfires of 2023 exceeded the annual fossil fuel emissions of 7 of the 10 largest emitting countries in 2022. Only 3 other nations, China, India and the USA, emitted more fossil fuel-based carbon in the same period. The study, which has been published in the journal Nature, was carried out by Brendan Byrne, who's at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Last summer, we saw that there were these really enormous fires in Canada that went through the entire summer. And so we wanted to estimate how much carbon was released from all those trees burning. And in addition to that, we wanted to understand why this happened in 2023 and not some other year. So we also looked at climate data to see if there was something unusual in particular about 2023.
How do you go about doing a study like this to actually get numbers that are a reasonably good guesstimate of what happened?
When fires burn, they release a lot of smoke and aerosols into the atmosphere. And one of the things they release is carbon monoxide, which is produced by fires. There are satellites that measure the amount of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. So what we did is we took satellite data of the amount of carbon monoxide emitted by the fires, and then we were able to use that to back calculate how much carbon must have been emitted when they burned.
Were you watching one particular patch of space then? Or do you assume that the carbon monoxide's only around for a little while, so anything that gets added is just been added and you can measure the background level everywhere and that gives you that approximation?
Well, the nice thing about carbon monoxide is that in general, forests are not releasing very much when there isn't a fire. It's really a signal of, fires burning. And so from there, you can really see it kind of like you would see a smoke plume coming off the fires. So there's pretty low background levels.
Does it hang around for long? Because how good a register is it of what's happening here and now? Because if you produce some carbon monoxide, does it not sort of go up and then saturate in the atmosphere and then you lose what else goes on since? Or does it go up and come down quite quick, which means you really have got a moment-to-moment index of what is happening on the ground?
Yeah, the nice thing about carbon monoxide is that it lasts for about a month in the atmosphere. It's converted into CO2 through chemistry in the atmosphere. So it doesn't have the real long lifetime of CO2, which gets really mixed into the background, or the very short lifetime of ozone, which is just there momentarily. So it's kind of a perfect lifetime to be able to track fires with.
And what did that reveal then about how much you think came off from Canada when the fires raged?
Yeah, we provided an estimate range of 570 to 727 megatons of carbon. I think this is better contextualized when you look at countries' fossil fuel emissions. So this would have ranked as the 4th largest emitting country after China, the US, and India. So we saw really unprecedented amounts of carbon being released from these fires over Canada.
Because we always regard trees as a good thing to have. We plant trees, they soak up CO2. But then if you have events like this, you liberate all of the good work that's been done and put the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Is that sort of what was in your mind when you were doing these calculations?
Yes, to an extent, everything else being equal. If you have a forest fire, you'll release a bunch of carbon, but that forest will regrow over the coming decades. So you'd expect it to reabsorb all of that carbon, but we may not see that with climate change.
In what respect?
When we looked at this event, we found that these really extreme emissions coincided with the hottest and driest year for Canadian forests in the climate records we looked at that were 44 years long. And so, we're seeing under hotter and drier conditions that you'll potentially have more extreme fires.
So more fires, but potentially also less regrowth then if the conditions are more stressful for the trees and they're not going to lock away as much CO2 as normal. So it's potentially a double whammy then.
Yes. So what we see is that, this year was very unusual with the heat and drought relative to the 44-year climate record. But if we look at climate model projections, by the time we get to the 2050s, we find that this becomes kind of a normal summer temperature-wise for Canada. So we may potentially see a shift to having more frequent, intense fires that could potentially change how the ecosystems are able to store carbon.
That is a worry, isn't it? Brendan Byrne there, he's from NASA's JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith. Still to come, why those astronauts are still stranded on the International Space Station. But first though, the University of Cambridge's Bill Amos has been involved in a project that aims to eradicate mink from the UK's waterways. American mink began to spread through the UK after they escaped or were released intentionally from mink farms, which were banned almost a quarter of a century ago here. To find out more, I caught up with Bill on the banks of the River Cam at Queen's College in Cambridge.
So the American mink was brought over as a source of fur, and they were farmed extensively throughout the UK. And when fur farming became less of a nice thing to do, many of them were just released or escaped. And so around the 1920s, 1930s or so, an awful lot of mink entered the English countryside, where they found themselves very nice places to live.
What do we think the population of them is then?
Very difficult to tell. There are fewer probably than we think. We've basically looked to eradicate them from East Anglia as a start of tackling the problem. And in East Anglia, we've probably caught 300 or 400, and we now think that there are none left. So it's not seething with them, but they do an awful lot of damage.
So you don't need many to have quite a devastating impact on the ecosystem.
Absolutely. They really are voracious hunters, and they will hunt anything that they can catch. There are pictures of them attacking animals as large as a heron, which is, considering the mink itself is only about 1.5 foot long, that's impressive.
How are you trying to get rid of them then?
People have tried before, but the problem is that you have to be humane. You can't just allow them to starve to death in empty traps. So earlier trapping efforts really suffered from the fact that you need to inspect every trap every day to see whether it's triggered. The modern traps we have are fantastic because they're fitted with a little telephone device, which means that they signal whenever they trigger. And so you can run 100 traps, and the one that actually catches something you can go and visit. And so you can actually be extremely humane in getting rid of the mink. And that's transformed the number of traps that you can have out in a given area. The other thing is that we've discovered that mink, they're incredibly inquisitive anyway, but if you've got the smell of another mink, then they really go to town. So now all the traps we use, they're baited with smell of mink, which is extracted from some of the dead mink we've culled as part of this process.
What smell in particular?
It comes from the anal glands at the back end, and the name of the scientific name for the mink is a mustelid, and must is the name that we use to describe some intense smells, and mink are very smelly animals, and this is where the smell comes from.
Are they attracted because they want to mate, or are they attracted because they think this is a potential rival, or is it both?
Probably both. We get males and females coming to the smell of mink. We have had traps before which have caught nothing, caught nothing, caught nothing. There's a camera trap nearby, there's a mink around. You put the lure in, clonk, within 24 hours it's caught the mink, and then you see nothing on the camera traps. So it's incredibly potent at mopping up the last few.
This is then presumably your strategy going forward, that we use both digital traps that can be put at scale so that you can monitor very big flotillas of traps, as it were, but equally you bait them up with this smell of mink, which enormously improves the efficiency of the whole operation.
Absolutely. It's completely transformed. I would say over a period of something like 2 to 4 years, you can clear a really large area. And this is transformative. Previously, people were putting out traps. They were having to visit them every day. You couldn't get enough traps. And mink reproduce quite fast, so they were just replenishing, and you'd never get to elimination. And many people thought that it was actually impossible to eradicate mink from the UK.
Is eradication possible? Because elimination means we've cleared them from a geographical area. Eradication means we've cleared them totally. Do you think the latter is feasible? Because if they have a lot of babies, it doesn't take very many mink to quite quickly repopulate.
No, we really do think this is possible. So we've gone, I think the main part of using smart traps and lures started in about 2020, and already basically there are no mink in East Anglia. So, I mean, really a huge chunk. Loads and loads of traps, not a single catch last year, and no evidence of reproduction for 2.5 years. So, and that's a large piece of the country. So all those traps, or many of those traps, are now being redeployed further out, and we're trying to spread out across the UK. And yeah, as soon as the trapping goes, you start off catching loads, and within a very short period of time, trap numbers plummet, the number that you're catching plummets, and yes, eradication or clearing of an area follows quite quickly.
Cambridge University's Bill Amos there. It looks like 2 of NASA's most experienced astronauts who've been stuck in space already for 2 months won't return to Earth until at least February 2025. Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore were only supposed to take part in an 8-day mission, but a problem with their Boeing Starliner spacecraft that took them to the International Space Station in the first place means they're going to be remaining there until next year. With me to explain what's going on and what will happen to the 2 astronauts is broadcaster Richard Hollingham from the Space Boffins podcast. And he's the perfect person to ask because not only has he parted with one of the astronauts, it turns out, he's also just penned a piece for the BBC called What Happens When Astronauts Get Caught in Space.
This is Boeing's Starliner, the rival to the Dragon spacecraft. It's been much delayed. Its trial uncrewed flights were not wholly successful. This was its first crewed flight to the International Space Station. And what they found was on approach to the space station, 5 of the thrusters, there are 28, 5 of them failed. They recovered the spacecraft fine, docked successfully, they're on the space station. The question then is, are these thrusters going to fail again? So there have been tests ever since. And, well, I think the best word to sum them up is inconclusive. So that's why they've made the decision to keep them there.
So this is a bit like having a car parked in the garage. And you could jump in it, but you might break down on the motorway. And obviously when it's life and death like this, no one's willing to take that risk.
Yeah, so it's a little complex with the problem with the thrusters because they don't entirely understand what's happening. They've been running a load of tests in space, docked to the space station, and in space the thrusters seem to be absolutely fine. There seems to be no problem. The actual problem does appear to come down a single component, a Teflon element within the thruster, which seems to be swelling and reducing how much propellant passes through the thruster. That seems to be the problem. But in NASA's words, they do not understand the physics of the problem. So it might have fixed itself, it might be fine, but they don't know why. And that's obviously a real worry.
Why can't they just come home? I mean, I know I'm trivialising a bit, but what is the problem with sending something else up there to get them back? There are things going to resupply the International Space Station quite frequently, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, they could even actually fit in the Dragon that's docked to the space station. They could fit 2 extra people into that Dragon spacecraft. They could actually bring them back now. And it's about balance of risks, isn't it? So right now, the safest place to be is on the space station. If something catastrophic were to happen to the space station, a piece of space junk hit it, some sort of depressurization event, a fire, all the awful things that could go wrong in space, they could come back straight away. And they'd either come back jammed into the Dragon capsule, which is already docked to the space station, which is the SpaceX spacecraft, or they could come back on Starliner because the risk suddenly shifts. So right now, it's safer to stay on the space station. And given that these astronauts are so well trained, the best option, I think, is to keep them on the space station, extend their mission, send a spacecraft up with 2 spare seats, and then they come back after just a long duration mission, which is very usual on the space station, and they come back early in the new year.
I did hear that the one downside for the 2 astronauts is they didn't pack many pairs of pants. I'm being slightly facetious, but they didn't take extra clothes, and you of course you don't do that when you're going to space. Weight's everything. You don't take what you don't need, so they're kind of living in the same clothes a lot.
It's true. And, also that they had to actually take some of their personal possessions off Starliner to take in some spares for the plumbing system on the space station. So even on their 8-day mission, they didn't have many personal possessions with them. So some have been sent up since. More will be sent up in supply missions and in the Dragon mission, which will now only carry 2 astronauts. There are going to be some difficult decisions made at NASA about which 2 astronauts get bumped off that mission. I wouldn't want to be in those meetings. So they are going to get some personal possessions, I imagine, too, either in the Dragon mission coming up or in a forthcoming supply mission. There's supply missions all the time. They'll also take up their presents for Christmas as well.
Have you interviewed or met the pair of them? Having made, you made hundreds of space programs and episodes of things like Space Boffins over the years. Have you had them on the program?
No, I've not interviewed Butch or Sonny, but I have been at a party with Sonny Williams. So I used to do the live launch commentaries for the European Space Agency when Soyuz flights launched with NASA astronauts or the European Space Agency astronauts to the International Space Station. So I was in Moscow Mission Control, and she was one of the astronauts assigned there. So they always had astronauts there in the sort of support roles in Moscow. And so I was at a party with Sonny Williams. I can confirm she is lovely, very chatty, great person. The ideal companion on a space station.
Richard Hollingham from Space Boffins there. Well, speaking of space, it's time now for our question of the week, and we are looking moonward with this one. James Titko has been investigating this on behalf of listener Heather.
What would the difference be to the Earth if the collision which resulted in the formation of the moon had not happened? Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Your question refers to the giant impact hypothesis, our best guess as to how our moon formed. It's the idea that the Earth collided with another planet, which set both bodies on the path to their present trajectories. And we've been able to track down just the man who can help with your question. Dana McKenzie is the author of The Big Splat, or How Our Moon Came to Be. I asked him what Earth would have been like before the giant impact.
To be honest, James, we don't know much about the Earth before the impact because whatever was there before was totally scrambled. A lot of the impactor plunged into Earth. Some of it was blown off into space, and also a lot of Earth's mantle was churned up and thrown out. All this material made a disk, sort of like the disk around Saturn, but much denser, much less stable. And so that disk rapidly coalesced and formed our moon. And this was about 4.5 billion years ago. What are some effects of the giant impact? So first of all, the length of our day, 24 hours, is governed by the Earth's rotation. That rotation rate was set by this giant impact. In fact, that impact was oblique and set the Earth spinning at about once every 8 hours. So we had 8-hour-long days. Gradually, over the billions of years since then, our days have slowed down to our present 24 hours. But it's fair to say that we would have slower days even than that if we had never had the giant impact. Another big effect of the impact is tides, because we have a moon. Our moon is larger relative to our planet than any other body in the solar system except for Pluto. So the moon has an outsized effect on our planet. A lot of people think that tide pools are where life evolved, the first life. And so possibly the moon has given us life. In any case, it certainly gave us tides. Another interesting thing that results from the impact is the Earth's tilt. So our planet is tilted by about 23 degrees, and that's what gives us our seasons. We might have had life without the moon, but life would certainly have been different if we hadn't had seasons. Another important aspect of having a moon, having the giant impact, is that the moon actually stabilizes Earth's rotation. So over the millions of years, the axes tend to move around a little bit. And this moving around has been much more pronounced in Mars, for example. And so they've had much more dramatic climate swings. Our poles move a little bit, but not a lot. And that has perhaps contributed to the stability of Earth's climate.
Absolutely fascinating how many different strands of science this question teases out when you start exploring it. From astronomy to geology to biology? What a great question. Thank you so much, Heather. And thanks also to Dana McKenzie, author of The Big Splat, or How Our Moon Came to Be. And there is more discussion on this subject over on the forum, which you can get involved in at nakedscientist.com/forum. Next time, we'll be answering this question.
This is Susie Jones. I teach astrophotography, and when I'm explaining how to photograph the night sky, I'm often talking about the exposure triangle being aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. With the shutter speed, we can slow that right down so that we are collecting information and recording it into a single image for 10 or 15 or 30 seconds or even longer with deep sky astrophotography. I would love to know what the equivalent of our human eye is. What is the shutter speed of our eye? Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And if you think you know the answer, do feel free to get involved in the conversation over on our forum. That's at nakedscientist.com/forum. Or you can, of course, send us an email. It's chris@thenakedscientist.com. And if you have a question that's been bothering you, why not send it in and we'll take a look. Next time, we're asking, could old mines actually be at the cutting edge of science? We'll hear from one company who are turning them into giant batteries. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here at the Naked Scientist team, thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.